Hey heroes, and welcome to another eternal episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelate. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. Today's tale begins with one of the most important abstract entities in the Marvel Universe, Eternity. In the seventh incarnation of the cosmos, from which the Marvel Universe as we know it originated, Eternity served as the embodiment of time itself. He has also been described as the sentient life force of the universe, formed by the collective consciousness of every living organism in creation. Together with his sister self, Infinity, the personification of space, the two collectively represent all that exists within the universe as the embodiments of actuality. Described as two sides of the same coin, Eternity and Infinity have been referred to by different sources as mates, siblings, and even, in some sense, the same being. However, any one of these descriptors is certainly an oversimplification. Additionally, every reality in the multiverse has its own incarnation of both Eternity and Infinity, each of whom is a facet of a larger multiversal entity of the same name. In any event, our story today kicks off in 6th century England during the reign of King Arthur Pendragon and the Knights of Camelot. During this era, one of Camelot's mightiest champions was a masked warrior known as the Black Knight, who was secretly a distant relative of the royal family, Sir Percy of Scandia. Meanwhile, there arose a guild of warlocks who plotted to overthrow Arthur and create a land without kings, in which the power of governance was in the hands of the people. To this end, they used secret knowledge and arcane arts to successfully obtain a tiny sliver of eternity, just enough to weave into a full face mask. With this Eternity Mask, as it came to be known, the guild transformed a lowly commoner into their own masked champion, one who soon came face to face with the Black Knight, Sir Percy. While Percy was considered a master swordsman in his time, the man in the Eternity Mask was nonetheless able to match his talents, for you see, this was the power that was woven into the mask itself. Whoever wore it was endowed with the same strength and skill as anyone they faced, instantly leveling the playing field. As such, the battle between them lasted for 3 full days until an exhausted Sir Percy narrowly prevailed. However, in the wake of this battle, he simply had no strength left to stop the Warlocks Guild from simply taking the Eternity Mask and escaping. And of course, the time of Camelot did eventually come to an end as King Arthur and his illegitimate son, Mordred the Evil, struck each other down during the Battle of Camlan. Over the following centuries, the Eternity Mask changed hands a number of times, but continued to be used as a tool to challenge the monarchy. The mask also communicated on some level with those who wore it, giving them information related to the nature of reality and guiding them to where they needed to be. I should note that the mask is also capable of changing shape and thus may look different depending on the wearer and the time period. It was reportedly sighted during the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, the English Civil War in the mid-1600s, and the American Revolution in the 1700s, where, if the rumors are to be believed, its magic was harnessed by Ben Franklin to help free the colonists from British rule. The mask remained in the United States after that, and in the mid-1800s, it was found by a man named Jim Gardley. Originally a rancher in Cactusville, California, in 1849, Gardley was accosted by a robber baron named Cal Brunder, who wanted to buy his land. After Gardley refused, Brunder framed him for rustling and had him jailed, largely to prevent him from inspiring further pushback. However, Gardley soon escaped and, after raiding his own ranch for supplies, spent several weeks practicing his marksmanship. He also successfully captured and tamed a wild horse, who he named Lightning. Finally, he donned the Eternity Mask and vowed to fight for justice by defending the poor and oppressed. Thus, Jim Gardley became known as the Masked Raider, one of the earliest costumed crime fighters in the Marvel Universe. As a side note, I mean that both in terms of continuity and publication date, as the Masked Raider originally debuted in 1939's Marvel Comics #1, the book for which the entire universe is named. In his first outing, he successfully rallied the townsfolk in a revolt against Brunder and his gang, but this was only the beginning. True to his vow, he continued his adventures over the following years, and by the 1870s, the Masked Raider had become a legendary figure on the American frontier. But for the next part of our tale, we turn our attention to a young man named Matthew Morris Masters. His mother, Jezebel, died during childbirth, and his father was killed 5 years later by a criminal named Luke Davis. At age 13, Matthew Masters became a gunslinger known as the Cactus Kid and started hunting Davis and his gang. That search lasted 4 years until Masters finally encountered Davis and his gang in Jefferson County, Texas, and after the ensuing gunfight was over, only the Cactus Kid was left standing. Masters was arrested after that, but the judge was lenient and placed him on probation, due to the fact that the Davis gang had been a notorious menace for some time, responsible for as many as 27 murders. In the original telling of this story, it was the governor of Texas who pardoned Masters for his various misdemeanors, but the point remains that because of Masters' relative youth, he was given an opportunity to turn his life around. Having seen so many dead and wounded during his travels, he declared that he wanted to become a doctor, and the judge, or governor, helped him make it happen. Masters attended medical school at a university in Mexico and 6 years later set up his own practice in a border town known as Leadville. This is where our stories converge because around this time, circa 1880, Masters came upon the Masked Raider, who had finally lost a gunfight after 3 decades of crime fighting. Masters attempted to save the hero's life, but the moment he removed the Eternity Mask, Gardley passed away, succumbing to a dozen bullet wounds. While Masters initially blamed himself for Gardley's death, he quickly realized that the ones who had actually shot him were still out there, and donned the Eternity Mask, which guided him to them. Now, he was initially reluctant to renew his life of killing and gunfights, but then he met an elderly rancher named Jim Lathrop and his daughter Marie. The foreman of Jim's ranch had been shot by a murderous land robber named Blast Burrows, and while Masters was trying to save Charlie's life, Burrows himself arrived at the clinic to finish the job. When Masters refused to go after Burrows, Jim Lathrop decided to do so himself and caught a bullet for his troubles. Fortunately, the injury wasn't fatal, and Masters, a very competent doctor, was able to save his life. Realizing that he couldn't keep standing idly by, but not wanting to compromise his medical practice, Dr. Matthew Masters donned the Eternity Mask and crafted the costumed identity of the Black Rider. His trusty steed Ichabod was even trained well enough to behave differently while acting as the rider's white horse, Satan. Naturally, the Black Rider ultimately killed Blast Burrows and took down his gang, but this was only the start of his heroic career. Marie Lathrop, of course, was infatuated with the swashbuckling gunslinger, but had a little time for his alter ego, considering Dr. Masters to be a yellow-bellied coward. Meanwhile, her younger brother, Bobby, became one of the few people to learn of the Doctor's dual identity, and even helped him on several occasions. Over the following years, the Black Rider helped protect the Lathrop family and the town of Leadville in general, fighting against lawlessness and injustice. He even befriended the local Native American community and on more than one occasion prevented unnecessary conflicts from breaking out between them and the frontiersmen, usually by joining forces to take out the unscrupulous white men who would benefit from instigating such conflicts. I will point out that this is not what one might expect from some of these old comic book covers, which depicted a much more stereotypical cowboys versus Indians situation, but I suppose this was basically the 1950s version of clickbait. In any event, Dr. Masters eventually retired from his life of superheroics, fairly wealthy in his old age, and moved to New York City. And so we now jump from the 19th century to the 20th as we turn our attention towards another young man, Dennis Piper. The son of a ruthless military officer, Dennis underwent intense physical training from an early age, but had no interest in becoming a soldier himself, much to his father's annoyance. With the onset of the Great Depression, an adult Dennis Piper started stealing from the rich so that he could give to the poor, and in 1930 he targeted none other than Dr. Matt Masters. Impressed with Piper and slowly dying of cancer, Masters decided to entrust the Eternity Mask to the dashing rogue. With it, Piper continued his activities as a masked vigilante known simply as the Operative, and sought to hold the rich accountable for their misdeeds. Meanwhile, his own father became known simply as the General, and served as the head of the Board, a cabal of the social elite who maintained their wealth at the cost of others. The General also made a deal with a demonic entity known as Nox, who is perhaps best known as being one of the Seven Fear Lords, a group of enigmatic and cosmically powerful entities, which also includes the likes of Nightmare, Despair, and the Dweller in Darkness. I will note that she has at times involved herself with the Greek gods, like when she posed as Aphrodite to seduce Ares and produce two sons, Phobos and Deimos. As a result, it was once posited that she was actually Nyx, the Greek goddess of night. However, Nyx is indeed a separate entity entirely, which makes sense given the fact that Nox has also claimed to be even older than the gods of Olympus. But I digress. In his quest to obtain power, the General captured the Broadway starlet, Alice Starr, in 1932 and sacrificed her to Nox. Furthermore, he framed Starr's lover for this murder, who just so happened to be his own son, Dennis Piper. Evading the police, Piper joined forces with Alice's sister, Sarah Starr, who utilized special flying equipment as the Aviatrix, as well as the mystical showman Ezekiel Wright, better known as the Revenant. Meanwhile, Nox revealed to the General the location of an amulet that would endow the wearer with incredible power, one that was once worn by the legendary hero Achilles. The General sent an archaeologist named Professor Lewis Green to bring him this artifact and intended on killing him once he did. However, Green survived by claiming the amulet's power for himself and ultimately aided the Operative and his team of mystery men. Another who ended up joining their cause was a doctor named Rupert Kingsley. He was originally from the small town of Dark Willow in West Virginia, where the local miners were striking in the hopes of getting better wages and living conditions. The local sheriff department, however, beat a number of the protesting workers nearly to death and forbade Kingsley from treating them. Despite this, Kingsley later visited the home of one of the battered workers and did what he could for him. In response, the cops burned down Kingsley's home as he slept, and while he survived, he was left horribly scarred and disfigured. Wrapping himself in bandages, Kingsley became a brutal vigilante known as the Surgeon, and when he discovered that the board were the owners of the mining company and the ones responsible for what happened in Dark Willow, he traveled to New York and joined the Operative's mystery men. The General, meanwhile, planned on sacrificing a group of children to fully empower Nox, and naturally the whole situation culminated in a battle between the Mystery Men and the General's forces, which included a litter of canine creatures that Nox had previously spawned with the Hound of Hades, Cerberus. The General was also transformed into a wolf-like monster thanks to his deal with Nox. However, the Operative was able to slay him by borrowing Achilles' sword and beheading him, ending his schemes once and for all. Nox was defeated as well, however, Lewis Green was forced to sacrifice his own life to accomplish this. The Mystery Men continued working together for a time, but by 1940 Dennis Piper had abandoned the identity of the Operative and put the Eternity Mask away. Changing his name to Leslie Lenroe, he became a prolific crime writer as well as a private detective known as the Ferret. As part of this new identity, he adopted a well-trained ferret named Nosy, who accompanied him on various cases and even aided him on occasion. But for the next part of our tale, we turn our attention back to the group who first created the Eternity Mask. Passing their knowledge down through the generations, what was once a cadre of warlocks eventually became known as the Scientists Guild, and among their ranks there were 3 men of particular note. There was the American medical biologist Jerome Hamilton, the Lithuanian nuclear physicist Maris Morlack, and the Spanish electronics technician Carlo Zota. In 1939, these 3 were sent by the Guild to bear witness to Professor Phineas Horton's Synthetic Man, the original Human Torch, whose debut heralded the beginning of an entire generation of marvels. By 1940, Hamilton, Morlack, and Zota also operated as a trio of crime busters known as the 3 X's, during which time they apprehended a South African villain known as the Green Terror, who had developed a method of prolonging his own life indefinitely by stealing the blood of the young. With more of these kinds of uncanny individuals emerging and a second Great War spreading across Europe, the 3 X's came to believe that the next stage of humanity would be shaped by these marvels, or X-humans as they called them. Intending on being at the forefront of this, the X's tracked down the former operative, now the Ferret, and retrieved the Eternity Mask from him. Already stronger and faster than most, the Ferret never really noticed the mask's magic and was willing to hand it over if it would help the Allies in their war against Nazi Germany. Working with the United States government, the X's used the Eternity Mask, as well as the Guild's ancient eldritch knowledge, to initiate Project Thunderer. This experiment was conducted in a government facility hidden behind an unassuming curio shop, where at the same time Steve Rogers was being transformed into the super soldier known as Captain America. The volunteer for the 3 X's project was an FCC radio officer named Jerry Carstairs. Donning the Eternity Mask, he became known as the Thunderer, battling both Nazi agents and American criminals, but on at least one occasion was referred to as the Black Avenger. Of course, the Second World War came to an end in 1945, however, Steve Rogers was MIA since his confrontation with Baron Zemo earlier that year, and another man, Bill Naseland, previously known as the Spirit of 76, took over the role of Captain America. Meanwhile, the 3 X's met another man who shared their worldview, a Polish geneticist named Władysław Szyński, who previously mentored the notorious Arnim Zola. In 1946, Władysław Szyński and Carlo Zota convinced the Human Torch's creator, Professor Horton, to build a second synthezoid, one that named itself Adam 2. However, this time Szyński and Zota provided the programming, resulting in a much less noble creation. Considering himself superior to humanity, Adam 2 created his own robotic servants and planned on conquering the United States by replacing political candidates with loyal androids, starting with John F. Kennedy. This scheme was ultimately thwarted and Adam 2 was defeated by a superhero team called the All Winners Squad. However, Bill Naseland was killed during the conflict. Having met Bill prior to this and considering him a friend, Jerry Carstairs turned against the Scientists Guild and refused to continue being their Thunderer. Now calling himself the Dark Avenger, he spent the better part of a decade keeping the Eternity Mask out of the Guild's hands, as he realized the X's wanted to use it to impose their own order on the world. However, by 1956, the X's successfully killed their former agent and retrieved their prize. They hoped that the mask's magic would allow the wearer to gain intellect equal to all who surrounded it, but because the Eternity Mask was created to oppose monarchies, it would not work for those that wished to control the world themselves. Shinsuke came to the conclusion that the only way to create a perfect world was to breed a race of perfect humans to rule it, a race of kings that were far more evolved than Phineas Horton's synthetic creations. Furthermore, Shinsuke provided the X's with longevity treatments, allowing them to significantly slow their aging. Now, with decades with which to plan, the guild itself evolved once again, and in 1958 they officially became known as the Enclave. Each of the X's faked their death and relocated to a small, remote island that held an abandoned outpost built by the monstrous but technologically advanced civilization, the Deviants. Using this, as well as data that Shinsuke had previously received from the rogue inhuman Fader, the Enclave created an advanced citadel of science, which they playfully nicknamed the Beehive. Eventually, after years of work, as the Marvel Age dawned and a new generation of superhumans emerged, the Enclave created what they believed to be their genetically perfect man, known at the time simply as him. However, their creation escaped containment and forced the scientists back with a blinding wall of light. Wanting to witness what they had made, Jerome Hamilton abducted the blind sculptress Alicia Masters, hoping that she could get close to it. In a sense, this worked as Masters was able to guide Hamilton directly to him, who had encased himself in a cocoon in an underground storage chamber. With the blinding light subsided, Hamilton saw this and grew afraid of what might come out. Regretting the choices he'd made that led to this, he attempted to kill him, but the cocoon then hatched, releasing a surge of energy that caused a cave-in around them. Alicia escaped with the aid of her allies, the Fantastic Four. However, Hamilton was caught in the falling debris, and the others believed him dead. Shinsuke, Zoda, and Warlock finally caught sight of their creation before he left the Beehive in ruins and departed into space, where he subsequently became the cosmic adventurer known as Adam Warlock. Meanwhile, Jerome Hamilton actually survived, but was ironically left blind himself. However, as he felt his way around the remains of the storage chamber, he just so happened to place his hand on the Eternity Mask, and claimed it for himself. As a result, Jerome Hamilton became a masked vigilante known as Blind Justice, who sought to eliminate those who subjugated others, but always used non-lethal weapons against henchmen and flunkies. He largely stayed off of the radar of other heroes, but did have a brief run-in with Alpha Flight's founder, James MacDonald Hudson, after destroying an Enclave outpost in the Yukon. He was later seen by the avenging archer Hawkeye, who tried to apprehend him, but later witnessed Blind Justice being shot by one of his targets, and mistakenly believed that he'd been killed. Of course, Blind Justice survived, possibly because the Eternity Mask was able to keep him alive. Meanwhile, Shinsuke, Warlock, and Zoda continued their experiments, resulting in the creation of a second superhuman, initially dubbed Paragon. That creation later shifted to female form and eventually took a number of different aliases, including Her, Jaridia Starduster, and Kismet, before eventually becoming known as Aisha. She had a number of adventures in space, including one where Shinsuke, Warlock, and Zoda were also transformed into gold-skinned superhumans and attempted to solve the world's ills, but that situation proved to be temporary and the Enclave continued their scheming as human scientists. In a subsequent plot, Shinsuke and Warlock forced the Tibetan monks who had previously forged Dr. Doom's armor to create a pair of suits for them, allowing them to share a new masked identity, Crucible. They also enslaved Aisha and forced her to help them, and this whole situation culminated in a battle with the Fantastic Four on the island nation of Genosha. Having stolen Mr. Fantastic's genius, Maris Warlock began to fall into nihilistic insanity, which caused Shinsuke to betray him, seemingly killing him to become the sole Crucible. In the end, the Genosian Chief Magistrate, Tam Anderson, sacrificed herself to stop the Enclave, detonating a black hole bomb that banished both Crucible and Aisha to another dimension. Now, I should note that up to this point, everything that had happened was in the 7th incarnation of the cosmos. But after all of this, there was a multiversal crisis known as the Incursions, followed by a secret wars, in which nearly all of reality was wiped out and subsequently restored, meaning that beyond that point, we're technically in the 8th cosmos. Normally a multiversal reboot like this would result in a complete reset of reality where even the laws of physics could differ, but in this instance the continuity was preserved between iterations, which is symbolized by the fact that infinity became the representation of the 7th cosmos, while eternity remained the embodiment of the 8th. As we discussed at the top of this video, eternity and infinity are, in a sense, the same being, and so the 7th and 8th iterations of the cosmos are related similarly, with the only real delineation between them being that one includes the timeline of events before the multiversal secret wars, while the other contains everything that happened afterwards. Anyway, it wasn't until after all of that when the mutant adventurer Roberto da Costa, aka Sunspot, started digging into history and took notice of the Scientists Guild, as well as the peculiar synchronicities surrounding them. He enlisted the aid of the master investigator Jimmy Woo, a former FBI agent and head of the enigmatic Atlas Foundation, whose line of inquiry led him to learn of the Eternity Mask. Jimmy then recruited the masked vigilante Night Thrasher into this investigation, but by the time they tracked down Blind Justice, he was already dead and the Eternity Mask was missing. Furthermore, he appeared to have been murdered by some sort of chronal device, making it completely impossible to determine just how long he'd been dead. Meanwhile, the enigmatic individual who'd claimed the Eternity Mask for himself donned a black coat and cowboy hat, armed himself with a pair of 6-shooters, and became the new Masked Raider. Interestingly, the pistols he wielded appear to be the same ones that were used by the legendary 19th century vigilante Matt Hawk, better known as the Two-Gun Kid. Amidst his many adventures, the Two-Gun Kid even traveled to the Marvel Age and teamed up with the Mighty Avengers before returning to his own time. On his deathbed in 1938, he regaled his doctor, Thomas Halloway, with tales of these future heroes, and after he passed away, he left his guns and mask to Halloway, who used them to become the costumed vigilante known as the Angel. In the modern day, Steve Rogers passed these pistols on to Halloway's grandson, Jason. However, they were subsequently obtained by the man who would become the new Masked Raider. Meanwhile, as the sole remaining member of the Scientists Guild, Carlo Zota created a new Enclave and initiated a project dubbed Adam 4. For this scheme, rather than build a new android from scratch, Zota recovered and rebuilt the remains of Michael Korvac, a cyborg from the 31st century who had previously obtained cosmic power by stealing knowledge and technology from Galactus's world ship. Shockingly, Korvac betrayed Zota and left to pursue his own plans. At the same time, the Masked Raider infiltrated the Enclave facility, although he wasn't there to oppose Korvac, and that job ultimately fell to Iron Man. No, the Raider had come to stop Carlo Zota from using time travel magic to go back in time and start over. But by the time he arrived, Zota had already begun the incantation. The spell he attempted to use was one that had been written by the sorcerer Sissa Nej, a man from the 31st century who is considered the father of time magic. Sissa Nej is also notable for having used his magic to travel back to the dawn of time in an attempt to attain godhood, and while he succeeded in his apotheosis, he also achieved enlightenment in the process, and thus allowed reality to go unaltered by his actions. Too late to stop Zota from initiating the spell, the Masked Raider shot the spellbook, causing the magic to run wild and throw Carlo Zota all the way back to the 6th cosmos, where science itself originated. Intent on following him, the Raider went to Dr. Strange for help, and Strange assembled a team of defenders for the journey, which included the Silver Surfer, the Red Harpy, and the sentient nebula known as Cloud. They traveled back to the 6th cosmos and landed on the planet Ta, the birthplace of the being who would ultimately become the World Eater Galactus. There, they joined forces with a woman named Taya, the Science Seer Supreme and mother of Galactus. Meanwhile, Zota met with the devourer of that reality, the dreaded Omnimax, and voluntarily became his herald to gain cosmic powers. The defenders succeeded in defeating Zota, stripping him of his newfound might, but in the process the Surfer was pulled back to the 8th cosmos, while the wild magic surrounding Zota dropped him into the 5th. This multiverse was a realm of pure magic, and Zota wound up enslaved by the eldritch being Moridun. After another encounter with the defenders, he dropped backwards into the 4th cosmos, a reality populated not by organic life as we would understand it, but by living concepts and abstractions known as archetypes. Cloud decided to stay in that reality, while the remaining defenders pursued Zota to the 3rd cosmos, where they witnessed Lifebringer 1, the first hero, battling the primal void known as the Anti-All. This was not a struggle between good and evil, but a primal clash between existence and non-existence. There, in that basic incarnation of reality where the very concept of time had yet to be solidified, the Masked Raider finally caught up to Carlo Zota. With no superpowers between them, the two men fought, but in the end, Zota successfully turned the Two-Gun Kid's legendary pistol against the Masked Raider and pulled the trigger. However, when Zota then removed the Eternity Mask from the Raider's face, he saw that it was his own face beneath it. Carlo Zota was the Masked Raider. Of course, he didn't really understand what was happening until Eternity himself arrived. That is to say, the Eternity of Reality 616, who was a fragment of the larger multiversal Eternity, much like every soul within the 7th and 8th cosmos, are a piece of him. Thus, whoever wore the Eternity Mask was connected not just to Eternity himself, but to everyone, everywhere, and now fate had given the mask to Zota. This entire time, it was Eternity who had decided who would inherit the mask and when, all for this moment. Accepting his destiny, Zota realized that this was the only way this story could end, and donned the Eternity Mask, using it to aid Lifebringer 1 in its battle against the Anti-All, and thus ensure that existence persevered over oblivion. As the first hero struck down the primordial dragon, shattering it into pieces that would no doubt embed themselves into every reality forevermore, Carlo Zota seemingly disappeared in the blast, while the Eternity Mask fell into the hands of Stephen Strange, who later returned to his proper place in time with it. Meanwhile, Zota was returned to the 8th cosmos, but earlier than he'd left. Now, knowing what he needed to do, he met with Jerome Hamilton, Blind Justice, donned the Western outfit that had already been prepared for him, and obtained the Eternity Mask. Aware of the temporal loop that he now found himself in, Zota was nonetheless convinced that he could break free by doing better than the Masked Raider that he had killed. After killing Jerome with the chronal device and obtaining the Two-Gun Kid's 6-shooters, he made his way to his past self's Enclave and, well, I suppose you already know the rest. The Masked Raider got the Eternity Mask to the 3rd cosmos, where he was killed by his own past self, who then saved all of existence before becoming the Masked Raider. And so this week's tale draws to a close with an endless loop. One that happened because it already did. because it always needed to. For all eternity. Alright heroes, that is all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video, and you know what, if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. That being said, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!